Summer 1940. England. The Battle of Britain. Somewhere over the English Channel, a Spitfire pilot spots a Messerschmitt Bf 109 below him. He rolls and pushes the nose down to dive, the perfect firing position, the exact setup every fighter pilot trains for. His thumb moves toward the gun trigger. Then the engine stops. Not a dramatic explosion, not a burst of flame, just silence. The Merlin engine, the most powerful aircraft engine in the RAF's inventory, the engine that made the Spitfire the most feared fighter in the sky, simply quits. For 2, 3, 4 seconds. Long enough for the Messerschmitt to pull away. Long enough for the tactical moment to evaporate. Long enough, sometimes, for the pilot to die. The German pilot knew exactly what he was doing when he pushed his nose down. He had been briefed on it. His commanders had figured it out weeks earlier. The RAF's most advanced fighter had a flaw. A fundamental, embarrassing, potentially war-losing flaw, built into the very heart of its engine. And the RAF had no fix. By the spring of 1940, the complaints were stacking up at RAF headquarters, at the Air Ministry, at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and at the Rolls-Royce factories where the Merlin engine was built. Pilots were dying. Engagements were being lost. Germany's Air Force was exploiting a vulnerability that the British couldn't publicly acknowledge and hadn't yet solved. The solution came from a 31-year-old woman at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, who rode a supercharged Norton motorcycle at 106 miles per hour and had spent her entire career being told that engineering was not a suitable profession for her. Her name was Beatrice Shilling. The RAF called her fix Miss Shilling's orifice, and it saved the Battle of Britain. Beatrice Shilling was born on March 8, 1909, in Waterlooville, Hampshire. Her father was a village butcher. Her childhood was ordinary in almost every respect except one. From the time she was old enough to hold a spanner, she was more interested in how things worked than in anything else the world had to offer. At 14, she bought her first motorcycle, not as a means of transport, as a project. She stripped it down, understood it, rebuilt it, improved it. The motorcycle became a lens through which she understood the relationship between engineering theory and mechanical reality. The gap between what something is supposed to do and what it actually does when the physics gets complicated. That gap would define her entire career. She enrolled at the University of Manchester to study engineering in 1929. There were 2 women in the program. 2 in an entire university's engineering faculty, in a field that had decided, without much examination of the evidence, that women's minds were not suited to it. Shilling ignored the judgment. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering. Then she stayed and earned her Master of Science in Mechanical Engineering. She went to work at an electrical engineering company as an apprentice. She kept racing motorcycles on the side, not casually, not as a hobby, but seriously, competitively, at the kind of speeds that made other riders take notice. She set her sights on the Brooklands Gold Star, awarded to riders who completed a lap of the famous Brooklands circuit at over 100 miles per hour. She got it. There is a detail about her personal life that tells you more about Beatrice Shilling than any professional biography could. She had a partner, a fellow engineer named George Naylor, who also worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. He wanted to marry her. She told him she would not marry him until he had also earned the Brooklands Gold Star for lapping the circuit at over 100 miles per hour on a motorcycle. He earned it. They married. In 1936, Shilling joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, the primary research institution for British military aviation. The RAE was where the RAF's equipment problems came to be understood and solved. It was staffed by engineers, scientists, and technicians who worked in the intersection between theoretical knowledge and brutal practical necessity. Shilling was assigned to carburetor research and development. It was not glamorous work. Carburetors, the devices that mixed fuel and air before delivering the mixture to an engine's combustion chambers, were unglamorous, mechanical, and critically important. A carburetor that worked perfectly in level flight might behave very differently under the stress of combat maneuvers. Understanding why and fixing it was exactly the kind of problem that required the specific combination of theoretical grounding and mechanical intuition that Shilling had been building since she was 14 years old. When the war started in September 1939, she was promoted to technical officer with responsibility for carburetor research and development across the RAF's entire fleet. The timing was not coincidental, because by the time Shilling took that role, the carburetor problem that would define her career, the problem that was going to kill RAF pilots if nobody solved it, was already beginning to reveal itself, and it was much worse than anyone was publicly admitting. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that powered both the Spitfire and the Hurricane used a float bowl carburetor. The float bowl was a reservoir of fuel that sat above the carburetor's main jet. Under normal flight conditions, level flight, gentle maneuvers, climbing turns, the float bowl worked perfectly. Gravity kept the fuel where it needed to be. The engine received a steady, correctly proportioned mixture of fuel and air and produced the power it was designed to produce. Under negative G-force, everything changed. Negative G, the force experienced when an aircraft pushes its nose sharply downward, reverses the effective direction of gravity on the fuel in the float bowl. Instead of sitting calmly at the bottom of the reservoir, the fuel surges upward, away from the jet, starving the engine of its mixture. The engine doesn't explode, it doesn't seize. It simply stops receiving fuel in the correct proportion and quits. For a fraction of a second, sometimes 2 seconds, sometimes longer. In combat, fractions of seconds are everything. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 used a fuel injection system, a fundamentally different approach to delivering fuel that was not affected by changes in G-force. The 109 could push its nose down and dive freely. Its engine kept running through the maneuver without interruption. German pilots had figured this out, not from intelligence reports or captured documents, from experience. From noticing, in the middle of dogfights over England, that when they pushed their nose down sharply, the Spitfire behind them sometimes went quiet. From testing it deliberately. From sharing the observation up the chain of command and receiving briefings on exactly what it meant and how to use it. The Germans had a tactic. The British had a flaw. And the Battle of Britain, the air campaign that would determine whether Germany could invade England, was about to begin. By the spring of 1940, the problem was undeniable. The complaints were arriving from every level of the RAF's command structure. Pilots writing after-action reports, squadron commanders filing observations, station commanders escalating to group headquarters. The pattern was consistent, and the implications were clear. RAF fighters were losing engagements they should have won because of an engineering flaw that had been present in the Merlin engine since the beginning. The complaints landed at RAF headquarters, at the Air Ministry, at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and at the Rolls-Royce factories in Derby where the Merlin was built. They were received, logged, forwarded, and discussed. The response was institutional paralysis. The obvious long-term solution was to replace the float bowl carburetors with fuel injection systems, to do what the Germans had done and eliminate the physics problem at its source. This was understood. The engineering logic was clear. The solution was not in dispute. What was in dispute was the timeline. The Battle of Britain began in earnest in July 1940. The Luftwaffe was flying hundreds of sorties per day over England, attacking radar stations, airfields, factories, and eventually cities. RAF Fighter Command was stretched to its absolute limit. scrambling pilots multiple times per day, losing aircraft faster than the factories could replace them, losing pilots faster than the training schools could produce them, pulling Spitfires and Hurricanes out of operational service for engine overhauls. The time required to replace float bowl carburetors with fuel injection systems was not tactically viable. Every aircraft grounded for modification was an aircraft that couldn't fly when the next German raid came in from the Channel. So the RAF fought the most important air battle in its history with a known flaw in its primary fighter aircraft. And men died because of it. 544 RAF pilots were killed during the Battle of Britain. The official histories record the total. They do not break it down by cause. They do not separate the pilots who died from German guns from the pilots who died because a Messerschmitt pilot pushed his nose down at the right moment and the Spitfire behind him went quiet. That number, the specific cost of the carburetor problem, was never calculated publicly. It was buried in the gap between what the RAF knew and what it chose to acknowledge. The Flaw doesn't get a sentence in the most authoritative histories of the Battle of Britain. The official accounts describe the heroism and the sacrifice without explaining one of the mechanisms that made this sacrifice necessary. Beatrice Shilling understood all of this. She was at Farnborough in her laboratory working the problem. She had the full picture, the engineering reality of the float bowl carburetor, the tactical reality of the negative G problem, the operational reality that a full engine replacement was impossible while the battle raged. The question she was asking was different from the question everyone else was asking. Everyone else was asking, how do we replace the carburetor? Shilling was asking, how do we fix this carburetor in the field without taking the aircraft out of service? That reframe was everything. The float bowl carburetor failed under negative G because the fuel surged away from the main jet. The reason it surged was that there was nothing limiting the fuel's movement within the float bowl. The bowl was open. The fuel could go wherever the physics sent it. What if it couldn't? What if there was a restrictor, a precisely engineered orifice placed in the fuel line that limited the rate of fuel flow? Not enough to restrict the engine's power under normal conditions. Precisely calibrated to allow maximum fuel flow at the manifold pressures used for combat. 12 pounds per square inch for standard engines, 15 for supercharged ones. But small enough that under the brief surge of a negative G maneuver, the restriction would smooth out the flow disruption before the engine had time to quit. The device Shilling designed was a thimble-shaped brass disc, a washer, essentially, with a hole in it. The hole was the critical element, its diameter calculated with precision to allow exactly the right fuel flow for maximum engine power while preventing the catastrophic lean-out that caused the stall. It was, in purely visual terms, almost laughably simple. A small brass disc, a hole, a mounting system that allowed it to be installed in any Merlin-equipped aircraft without removing the engine or the carburetor. It could be fitted in the field by ground crew without taking the aircraft out of operational service. Shilling tested it. It worked. In early 1941, she packed up her team and began driving from RAF base to RAF base across England, fitting the restrictors herself. She gave priority to frontline units, the squadrons that were flying combat operations daily. She supervised every installation. She trained ground crew on the fitting procedure. She moved with the urgency of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. By March 1941, every aircraft in RAF Fighter Command had been fitted with Miss Shilling's orifice. The Germans noticed immediately, not because anyone told them, because the Spitfires and Hurricanes that had previously gone quiet when a Bf 109 pushed its nose down were now following them into the dive. The tactic that German pilots had been taught to rely on, the nose-down escape that exploited the British carburetor flaw, stopped working
German after-action reports noted the change. The RAF's fighters were suddenly more aggressive. They were following through maneuvers they had previously abandoned. The tactical advantage that the Luftwaffe had been quietly exploiting for months had disappeared. The Germans had no idea why. They couldn't know. The modification was invisible from the outside. The Spitfire looked exactly as it had before. Its performance specifications were unchanged. Nothing about the aircraft's exterior or its operational behavior, except that one thing, the engine staying on through a negative G dive, revealed what had happened. A woman at Farnborough had made a brass washer with a precisely calculated hole in it, and it had closed the gap.
To understand what Beatrice Shilling actually saved, you need to understand what the Battle of Britain actually was. Operation Sea Lion, Germany's plan to invade England, required air superiority over the English Channel and southern England. Without control of the air, the Royal Navy could destroy the invasion fleet before it reached the beaches. Without the invasion, Germany could not knock Britain out of the war. If the Luftwaffe had destroyed RAF Fighter Command, had ground it down past the point of effective resistance, the invasion would have become viable. The war in the West might have ended in 1940 or 1941. The United States would not have had a base of operations in England for the eventual invasion of Europe. The entire strategic trajectory of the Second World War would have shifted. The Battle of Britain was that consequential, and it was that close. At its lowest point, the last week of August and the first week of September 1940, RAF Fighter Command was genuinely close to breaking. The airfields in southern England were being systematically destroyed. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than replacements could be trained. Aircraft production was keeping pace with losses, but pilot production was not. The RAF was running out of the human beings needed to fly its planes. In that context, every aircraft that went unserviceable mattered. Every engagement lost to a preventable mechanical failure mattered. Every pilot who died because a German pilot had learned to push his nose down at the right moment mattered. Shilling's fix did not arrive in time to change the outcome of the Battle of Britain's most desperate phase. It arrived in early 1941, when the immediate crisis had passed, when the Luftwaffe had shifted from targeting airfields to targeting cities in the Blitz, giving Fighter Command the breathing room it needed to recover. But the fix's importance extended far beyond the Battle of Britain itself. From 1941 onward, RAF fighters could follow German aircraft into dives. The tactical equation that German pilots had been taught to exploit was permanently closed. The confidence that RAF pilots brought to combat, the knowledge that their engine would stay on through whatever maneuver the fight demanded, was a different kind of confidence than they had flown with in 1940. And there is the question of what would have happened without it. The permanent solution, replacing float bowl carburetors with fuel injection systems, took until 1943 to implement fully across the RAF's fleet. 2 years after Shilling's fix. 2 years during which RAF fighters were flying combat operations daily over occupied Europe, over North Africa, over the Atlantic convoy routes. Without the orifice, those 2 years of combat would have been fought with the same flaw that German pilots had been exploiting since 1940. Every negative G maneuver, every diving pursuit, every engagement where a Bf 109 pilot pushed his nose down and waited for the British engine to quit. Shilling's brass washer bridged that gap. A thimble-shaped disc with a carefully calculated hole, fitted to every Merlin engine in Fighter Command in the span of a few weeks by a team of engineers driving from base to base across wartime England. The RAF never fully publicized what she had done. The carburetor problem had been an embarrassment, an admission that Britain's most celebrated fighter aircraft had a flaw that Germany had been exploiting in the war's most critical battle. The official histories moved past it quietly. Shilling went back to Farnborough and kept working. She contributed to the Blue Streak missile program. She researched wet runway braking for high-speed aircraft. She worked on an RAF Olympic bobsled. She kept racing motorcycles. The engineering establishment that had spent her entire career placing obstacles in front of her, that had given her a profession populated by men who doubted her competence before she had opened her mouth, continued to under-recognize what she had contributed. She received the OBE in 1949, 8 years after she had driven from RAF base to RAF base, fitting the device that restored the tactical parity of British fighters in the war's most important air campaign. 8 years. The men who flew the Spitfires she fixed got statues. She got a letter from the king.
Beatrice Shilling died on November 18, 1990, from spinal cancer. She was 81 years old. She had worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment until 1969, 33 years. She had raced motorcycles competitively into her 60s and set a world speed record at 64. She had outlived the war, outlived most of the pilots whose engines she fixed, outlived the generation that had watched her drive from base to base across England with a box of brass washers and an engineer's certainty that the problem was solvable. She was appointed Officer of the Order of the British Empire. She was eventually recognized in the histories as the woman who solved the Spitfire's carburetor problem. Documentaries were made, articles were written, her name entered the record. But think about the timeline. The fix was installed in March 1941. The OBE arrived in 1949. The serious historical recognition came decades after that. The men who flew the aircraft she fixed were celebrated in real time. Parades, medals, newsreels, Churchill's speeches about the few. The woman who made it possible for those men to follow a diving German plane without their engine quitting received a letter from the palace 8 years later. What Shilling did was not glamorous. She did not fly a Spitfire over the Channel. She did not shoot down a Bf 109. She sat in a laboratory in Farnborough and asked a different question than everyone else was asking. Not how do we replace the broken thing, but how do we fix it right now with what we have without stopping the war to do it? That question, and the brass washer it produced, is why the tactic German pilots had been relying on stopped working in 1941. It is why RAF fighters followed German aircraft into dives that previously ended engagements. It is one of the reasons the RAF survived long enough for the permanent fix to be implemented, long enough for the Americans to arrive, long enough for the war to be won. She bought her first motorcycle at 14 with pocket money. She was one of 2 women in her engineering faculty. She refused to marry a man until he had proved himself on a racetrack at 100 miles per hour. The RAF gave her a problem nobody else had solved. She fixed it in months. Then she drove herself to every base in fighter command and fitted it by hand. That is who Beatrice Shilling was.